The dinner at L'Aventura in the Upper East Side was supposed to be a celebration. The restaurant was closed to the public, reserved entirely for Tony the Bricker Moretti and his inner circle. The scent of roasted veal, aged Barolo, and expensive cigars filled the air, mingling with the soft, melodic sounds of a live string quartet in the corner. Tony sat at the head of the table, laughing loudly, his chest puffed out with the arrogance of a man who believed he had just successfully orchestrated the coup of the century. He had spent months funneling Costello's money into his own accounts, flipping 3 of Costello's most loyal captains, and making a secret pact with the Genovese family to remove the Prime Minister from his throne. To Tony, tonight wasn't just a dinner, it was a coronation. But the laughter died in his throat when the heavy mahogany doors at the front of the restaurant swung open. Frank Costello walked in, alone, wearing a double-breasted midnight blue suit that looked like it had been carved from the night sky itself. He didn't have bodyguards. He didn't have a weapon. He only had that calm, terrifyingly steady gaze that had made him the most powerful man in the city for decades. The room went ice-cold. The captains who had promised their loyalty to Tony suddenly found their eyes glued to their plates. Costello walked slowly toward the table, his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous room. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, like a father watching his child make a fatal mistake. He reached the head of the table and stood directly across from Tony. "It's a beautiful spread, Tony," Costello said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that carried more authority than a shout. "But I think you've forgotten one very important guest." Without waiting for an invitation, Costello pulled out a chair and sat down. He waved his hand at the waiter, who was trembling so much he nearly dropped his tray. "A plate for me, please. And a clean one for Mr. Moretti. I think his current meal is about to become very difficult to swallow, if you are watching this and you can feel the air leaving the room. Then you are starting to understand the sheer weight of Frank Costello's presence. Most bosses would have sent a car full of hitmen to spray the front of this restaurant with lead. But Costello? He understands that a bullet in the head is a quick exit, whereas a seat at the table is a psychological execution. We are breaking down the silent table strategy, the moment when a leader proves that he doesn't need an army to disarm a room full of traitors. He only needs the truth. If you want to learn how to master the art of strategic intimidation, how to walk into a room of people who want you dead and make them beg for your forgiveness, then you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now to join the Brotherhood of High-Level Thinkers. Like this video to show that you recognize the Prime Minister as the ultimate architect of power. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type "bullet" in all caps. Let's see who among you understands that the most dangerous weapon is the one you never see coming. Now, let's go back to that table, where Tony Moretti's life was about to be served to him on a silver platter. The waiter placed a fresh, white porcelain plate in front of Tony. Costello reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, gleaming .38 caliber bullet. He placed it in the center of Tony's plate with a delicate, silver clink sound that echoed like a bell. Tony's face went from a confident red to a sickly, pale white. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. "Frank, what is this?" "We're just having dinner. We're celebrating the new contracts." Costello ignored him, picking up a piece of bread and dipping it into the olive oil. He chewed slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch until it became a physical weight on Tony's chest. "You've been very busy, Tony," Costello finally said. "Moving the numbers, talking to Vito in the shadows, promising these men a world that isn't yours to give. You thought I was getting old. You thought I was losing my grip on the details. But I've always been a man of details, Tony. And the most important detail in your life right now is currently sitting in a middle school locker on 84th Street. Tony's eyes went wide with a primal, raw terror. His son, Leo, was 13 years old, his only child, and the pride of his life. "What are you talking about, Frank? If you touched my boy, I swear to God I haven't touched him, Tony," Costello interrupted, his voice gaining a sharp, lethal edge. "I'm the one who pays for his tuition, remember? I'm the one who sent the doctors when he had that fever last winter. I don't hurt children. I protect them. But I can't protect them from their own father's stupidity. You see, Tony, while you were busy planning this little dinner, one of my janitors was busy doing a safety inspection of Leo's backpack this morning. He found something very disturbing tucked inside the hidden pocket of his gym bag. He found a snub-nosed .38 revolver. A clean piece, no serial numbers. The kind of gun a desperate man uses when he wants to end a problem. Tony collapsed back into his chair, the breath leaving his body in a jagged gasp. The captains around the table looked at each other in horror. They realized the trap wasn't just for Tony, it was for the entire legacy of the Moretti family. You put a gun in my son's bag. Tony whispered, his eyes filling with tears of rage and helplessness. I didn't put it there, Tony. I merely found it, Costello replied, leaning forward until his face was inches from Tony's. But imagine what happens when the school security finds it. Imagine the police coming for your son. Imagine a 13-year-old boy being charged with felony possession of a firearm. His future, his scholarships, his life, gone. And all because his father thought he was big enough to sit in my chair. Costello picked up the bullet from the plate and held it up to the light. This bullet matches that gun, Tony. It's a set. A father's greed and a son's ruin. They go hand in hand in this business. The room was so quiet you could hear the wick of the candles burning. Tony looked at the men he had called his new captains, and he saw nothing but fear and desertion in their eyes. They weren't going to fight for him. They were already calculating how to apologize to Costello. Costello stood up, smoothing the front of his coat. He looked down at the broken man at the head of the table with a cold, detached pity. The choice is yours, Tony. You can try to walk out of here and continue your little rebellion. You can call Vito and tell him you're ready to move. But the moment you leave this room, I call the principal. I call the precinct. And I make sure your son is the one who pays the bill for your dinner tonight. Or, Costello paused, letting the word hang in the air like a guillotine, you can finish your wine, walk out that back door, and go to the house in the country. You will retire tonight. You will sign over every asset, every account, and every man to me. You will disappear from this city. And in exchange, my man will go back to that school and remove that disturbing item from Leo's bag before anyone ever sees it. Tony Moretti looked at the single bullet on his plate, then at the man who had just destroyed his life with nothing but a dinner reservation and a gym bag. He realized that Frank Costello didn't just rule the city, he owned the very air his family breathed. There was no move left to make. No escape. The Prime Minister had played the ultimate hand. Tony reached for his wine glass, his hand shaking so violently the liquid spilled onto the white tablecloth like a bloodstain. He drained the glass in one gulp and stood up. He didn't say a word to the men he had led to the brink of war. He didn't look back at the empire he had tried to steal. He simply walked toward the back door, a hollowed-out shell of a man, leaving behind his pride, his power, and the single bullet on the plate. Frank Costello sat back down in Tony's chair at the head of the table. He looked at the three captains who had betrayed him, his expression unreadable. The veal is getting cold, gentlemen, Costello said softly. Why don't we eat? We have a lot to discuss regarding the new management of the Moretti territories. The string quartet began to play again, a soft, haunting melody that filled the room as the janitors stepped out of the shadows to secure the perimeter. Frank Costello had faced a coup and ended it without raising his voice. He had protected his throne by threatening a legacy, proving once again that in the world of the Prime Minister, the most effective weapon isn't the one you fire, it's the one you place where it hurts the most. As the night went on, the only thing left of Tony Moretti's ambition was a single, cold bullet resting on a porcelain plate, a silent monument to the man who thought he could outplay the King of New York. Frank Costello watched the back door of the restaurant click shut behind Tony Moretti. The Viper of the docks was gone, reduced to a ghost in a $1,000 suit. The string quartet continued to play a mournful Vivaldi piece, their bows moving in perfect, terrified synchronization. Costello turned his attention back to the three captains remaining at the table. They sat as still as statues, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight, looking like men waiting for the axe to fall. Costello didn't say a word for a long minute. He simply picked up the single bullet from Tony's plate, rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, and then dropped it into the glass of Barolo in front of him. The red wine splashed against the crystal, turning the silver casing of the bullet into a dark, blood-soaked omen. "Eat," Costello said, his voice as soft as a falling shadow. "The food is paid for. It would be a sin to let it go to waste. And in this business, we have enough sins to account for already." While the captains choked down their veal under the watchful eyes of Costello's janitors, Tony Moretti was stumbling through the rain toward his car. His mind was a chaotic blur of fear and self-loathing. Every street lamp he passed looked like a police siren, every shadow looked like a federal agent waiting to take his son away. He reached his house in Westchester, a sprawling mansion built on blood money, and ran straight to the mudroom where Leo's backpack sat on a wooden bench. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely operate the zipper. He tore the bag open, dumping textbooks, notebooks, and pens onto the floor. And there, tucked inside the hidden lining of a gym bag, was exactly what Costello had described, a snub-nosed .38 revolver, cold and heavy, smelling faintly of gun oil and the end of the world. Tony collapsed to his knees, clutching the cold steel to his chest, sobbing not for his lost empire, but for the terrifying realization that Frank Costello had been inside his home, near his child, and he hadn't even heard a floorboard creak. If you are watching this and you are feeling that cold shiver down your spine, then you are finally understanding the God complex of Frank Costello. Most people think power is having the most soldiers. But Costello? He knows that true power is being the invisible guest at your enemy's dinner table. He didn't just win a turf war, he repossessed a man's soul. We are breaking down the legacy liquidation, the moment where a leader proves that he doesn't need to kill you to erase you. If you want to learn how to weaponize the very things your rivals love the most, if you want to see how the Prime Minister makes his enemies beg for the chance to disappear, then you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now to join the elite inner circle of power players. Like this video to show that you recognize Costello's backpack gambit as the most chilling move in Underworld history. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type surrender in all caps. Let's see who among you knows when the game is truly over. Now, let's go back to that mansion, where the real audit was just beginning. Tony sat on the floor for an hour, the gun in his lap, watching the sun begin to bleed over the horizon. He knew what he had to do. There was no calling Vito Genovese. Vito would only see a failed tool, and a failed tool is discarded. There was no calling the police. The police were the ones Costello was going to use to bury Leo. He picked up his phone and dialed the number Frank had given him. "It's done," Tony whispered into the receiver. "The gun is in my hand. I'm leaving now. Just tell your man to stay away from the school. Please." A calm, anonymous voice on the other end replied with only 4 words, "The debt is acknowledged." Within 30 minutes, a black sedan pulled into Tony's driveway. They didn't come to kill him, they came to collect the keys to his life. They took his ledgers, his offshore account codes, and the deeds to his properties. By the time Leo woke up for school, his father was gone, leaving behind only a note saying he had to take an urgent business trip to Italy. Back in the city, Frank Costello was already moving to the next phase of the purge. He didn't just want Tony gone, he wanted the Genovese family to feel the shockwave. He called a meeting of the commission, the High Council of the 5 families. They met in the back of a nondescript funeral home in Brooklyn, surrounded by the scent of lilies and formaldehyde. Vito Genovese arrived with a smirk, expecting to hear the news of Costello's demise. Instead, he found Costello sitting at the head of the long oak table, looking more energized than he had in years. Beside him sat the 3 captains who had been at dinner with Tony the night before. They weren't dead, they were transformed. They had spent the night giving Costello every detail of Vito's secret plans in exchange for their lives. Costello didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet pouch. He emptied it onto the table in front of Vito Genovese. 12 bullets rolled across the wood, clicking against each other like dice. 12 bullets, Vito, Costello said, his voice a Don Giruku, freezing, rasp. 1 for each of your captains who thought Tony Moretti was the future. Tony has retired to the countryside. His assets are now under my direct management. And these 12 men? They've spent the morning realizing that their own children's backpacks are unusually heavy today. The room went deathly silent. Vito's smirk vanished, replaced by a grey, ash-like pallor. He realized that Costello hadn't just stopped the coup, he had turned the entire generational hierarchy of the mob against itself. He had made fatherhood the ultimate liability. You wouldn't, Vito stammered, his eyes darting to the other heads of the families. The commission has rules, Frank. We don't touch the kids. That's the line. Costello leaned forward, the green light from the emerald ring on his finger glinting in the dim room. I didn't touch a single hair on a single head, Vito. I merely showed them what the world looks like when you stop being a father and start being a traitor. I offered them a choice, their ambition or their legacy. They chose their legacy. Every single one of them. By noon today, your entire ONU guard will be resigning their positions. You are a king with no army, Vito. You are a man standing on a PA, watching the ship sail away with everything you ever cared about. The brilliance of Costello's move was its total lack of physical violence. By threatening the children, he had triggered a primal instinct that overrode greed, ego, and even fear of death. The captains weren't staying loyal to Costello out of love, they were staying loyal because he was the only one who could ensure their children didn't grow up in a prison cell or a coffin. He had turned the very foundation of the Italian family structure into his own personal prison system. Vito Genovese stood up, his hands shaking, realizing that his power had evaporated in the time it took to eat a veal dinner. He left the funeral home a broken man, knowing that his reign was over before it had even truly begun. Frank Costello walked out into the crisp morning air of Brooklyn, the sun warming his face. He felt the weight of the city settling back into its proper place, under his feet. He had audited the rebellion and found it wanting. He had used a single bullet and a child's backpack to do what 1,000 hitmen couldn't. He had achieved absolute, bloodless peace. He walked to his limousine, but before he stepped in, he looked back at the funeral home. He thought of Tony Moretti, now a ghost in a far-off villa, and he thought of the boys in the schools, oblivious to the fact that their futures had been the currency of a war they would never understand. The cost of order is high, Costello whispered to himself, a rare moment of reflection for the man they called the Prime Minister. But the cost of chaos is higher. He got into the car and pulled away, disappearing into the maze of New York streets. The house of Costello was secure, the traitors were liquidated, and the lessons were learned. In the world of Frank Costello, you could steal his money, you could lie to his face, but the moment you threatened his peace, he wouldn't just take your life, he would take the ground your children walked on. And as the city hummed to life, the legend of the backpack bullet began to spread, a terrifying reminder that the Prime Minister was always watching, always counting, and always prepared to protect the legacy at any cost.